Hey there, I'm one of the developers in Titan, and in this video I'm going to be showing you some of the new features we've developed and are ready for use. So let's go ahead and log in first. And I'll just go ahead and open my workspace here. And now you can see two new items in the menu, API and Types Library. These two new features will be the focus of this video, and I'll try to explain through simple examples how can you, the user, use them to your advantage. So the first thing, I'll go ahead and explain APIs to you. So what are APIs? It stands for Application Programming Interface. I won't be going into too much of technical details. However, to summarize, with an API you can either request to get data or you can post your data for processing. These are called endpoints of an API. Titan offers you this simple protocol where you can create your API, and that has its own endpoints, which lets you to get or post data. So let's go ahead and go to the API page. As you can see, it is empty right now, and I'm going to walk you through the whole process of creating an API and using it in your flow. Alrighty then, when we go ahead and try to add an API, we are greeted with this dialog that requires three things from us: a name, a path, and an API key. You know what a name is, but might be wondering what the other two things are. Okay, so a path is basically the URL from where you can access your API. As you can see, it is already pre-appended with the Titan's URL. So a path you give will be for you to access it when you want to use the API. The API key is basically a key that you specify which will be needed in the authorization header of the request, so that only with this key can you access this API. Let's go ahead and fill up the form. To keep this simple, let's build an API that tells us about prices of fruits. I will give this API a name, fruit market. And for the path, I'll go ahead and say fruit. And for this example, I will keep the API key empty. And so now that my form is ready, I'll go ahead and add it, and there you have it. We now have an API that will respond to the path fruit. If we expand this, we can see an empty table about our endpoints. Like we discussed before, that an API will have endpoints doing different things. We gotta add endpoints to this API to use it. So let's jump right into it and see what happens when I try to add an endpoint. Again, I'm greeted with this dialog with the form. As you can see, it wants a path, type, and a body for request and response of the endpoint. The path, as before, is just an extension of where your API is reachable. You can see the API URL is already pre-appended, and all we have to do is add our own unique path. Let's go ahead and type in apple for the path, because I want to know the prices of an apple. Next is the type of the endpoint for this one. Let's go ahead and make this endpoint a get one. But what about these two here, request and response? Alright, so the thing is that when you have an endpoint and you try to ask for something, you send a request, and with that request you can send data in the form of JSON, list, or just a string. And the answer of the endpoint that you get is the response. That is also in the form of JSON, list, or string. So coming back to our endpoint, we just set the type of the endpoint to get, and based on the example we are currently doing, we do not need to send any data to the endpoint. That means we will keep the request empty and instead define a response. For the response, I would like to return an object with the following information: the name of the fruit, which will be of type string, the price of the fruit, which will be of type float, and let's go ahead and add some metadata, which will be of type object. And as you can see, I have a new key now, which is indented under metadata, which shows us that the new key is a child of metadata. Let's go ahead and add color to it of type string. Alright, the endpoint looks okay now. Let's go ahead and add it, and with that you can see we have our endpoint in the table. So now that we have an API with an endpoint, how do we use it? To do that, we have to go back to the flow page. Let's go ahead and create a flow. Let's call it API test and open it up. And now if you open the basics package in the brick pane, you can see two new bricks, API request and response. If you do not have the basics package installed, just go back to the brick store and install it. It takes less than 10 seconds. Let's add our bricks to the canvas and get it up and running. Before I connect them both, I will first apply the API we just created to both of them. To do that, just click on the brick, and from the property pane on the right side, select your API, and then you can also select the corresponding endpoint that you want the brick to operate on. Let's do the same for the other brick. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and connect them. On connecting, we see the port mapping dialog. And right off the bat, you can notice that the right side on the target, which is a response for the endpoint, has exactly the data that we need for the fruit. So we don't have to manually add it, and the API took care of it. Let's just feed some values to the response, and we're ready to go. To do that, I'll go ahead and add a constant, call it name, and put the value as apple. Since that's the fruit we're using in this example, let's add another constant called price, and let's give it a random number for the price. And now let's go ahead and finally add a color to set the color of the apple. Now let's go ahead and map all of these values to our response. Let's close this dialog and start our flow. Alright, now that our flow is running, how do we access the endpoint? Well, that's simple. In the APIs, if you go and edit the endpoint, you can see that you can access your endpoint from this URL. Inside Postman, I have the URL pasted here. Let's go ahead and give it a spin. And with that, I can see that I get back the values that I mapped. This was just an example of what APIs can do. However, with APIs, you can achieve a lot of things and let Titan serve as a platform that will listen to the requests and let you build the flows that allow to process these requests based on your requirements and respond with data that you need. Alright, so now that we are done with APIs, I would like to talk about another new feature that we've developed, the types library. Let's go ahead and open it up and see what we can do. Well, it's empty right now since it's a newly added feature and we are the ones who have to add anything to it. But what is the exact use of it? Well, as the name suggests, it is a library for your types. Now that our flows can handle a diverse variation of types, and we can start up our endpoints, build APIs, sometimes we need specific types that we need not only to reuse, but also make sure that we're keeping the usage of those types uniform across flows. Before this, before type library, if we had, let's say, an address with the name of the city, the street, and the postal code, and we had to use these three values throughout our flow, we had to go through and add them one by one to every connection we needed them. But with the type library, we can just pack them into one object, call it address, and just reuse it across all flows and also in the bricks. So let's go ahead and add our first type. To do that, let's turn on the edit mode and create our first type. So we're immediately greeted with this dialog, which isn't that hard to understand as most types in Titan are built in the same format. You have a name, a type, and then corresponding documentation for it. In case you need a little explanation on why you're building this type, this could be helpful for your team members that also collaborate with you in your workspace. Alright, so for this example, let's make a flow that responds with a random quote and the name of a person whose quote it is. So for that, let's go ahead and name our type enlightenment, set the type as object, and for the documentation we can write a general purpose variable to store quotes. And there you have it. The type is created. Let's go ahead and expand it, and let's start adding in our keys. So with that, our type is ready, and now we can use it in a flow. Let's go to the flow page and let's make a new flow, and this time call it type. Let's open it up and let's start setting up our flow. Alright, To set up this flow, we would need the following breaks: a request break and a response break that would cater to listening to the request and returning back the response. We would then need the HTTP client break. This is so that we can actually fetch a quote from a service in the internet and pass it on to the user. This break would ask a certain service for a quote, and it would return the quote and the author in the form of an object. Then finally, we would need a simple template processor. This is so that we could take the quote and form a nice message and return it to the user. Okay, so those are the breaks that I need. Let's go ahead and start connecting them. Let's start from the beginning. Connect the request break to the HTTP client. Here we don't really need to map anything because we don't need to send any data to the HTTP client break. However, we do need the request ID. So let's go ahead and add it to the buffer. Alright, so now let's connect the HTTP client break to the simple template processor. And now we can finally use our type that we just created. For the response JSON in the HTTP client break, we can edit the JSON and change the type to enlightenment. And when I do that, I see my two keys there. Let's do the same for the substitute. And as you saw, instead of adding these fields one by one on both the source and the target, all we did was just switch the type and we can just start using it. So I'm going to go ahead and map them, and let's be done with this dialog. Now let's go ahead and connect the template processor with the response break. Here we just need to map the request ID and then the result to a field that we can just add on the fly to the response map, just so that we could show it to the user. Before I start the flow, I need to edit the simple template processor. Let's click on it and let's edit it. Let's say a wise person named author said quote. Alright, now let's start our flow. Alright, now that the flow is running, let's go ahead and access it. Since this is our good old request and response breaks, the URL to access them will be the same as before. You can start with the Titan base URL and then add endpoint, then the username of the person who made the flow, and then the name of the flow, and then finally the name of the break, which will cater to the request. So the URL is ready. Let's go ahead and send. There you have it. A wise person named Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Let's run it again, and we get a different result. There you go. I think that's enough enlightenment for now. So that was a small example on how to use the type library. The types you create there can be used in all your flows as long as they are in a single workspace, and it can also help your team members to make use of it, which consequently helps everyone in the team to have uniform keys in all their types. So that was a small summary of the new features we now have in Titan. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to stay up to date with the latest additions to the platform, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Enjoy using Titan. I'll see you guys in the next one.